August 28, 1942. London, Whitehall. The morning air carried a brittle clarity, the kind that hinted at both promise and tension. You can almost hear the engines idle on the runway at Croydon, far to the south, and the distant echo of marching boots through cobblestone streets. In Downing Street, Winston Churchill stood by the window, cigar smouldering, eyes narrowing as the first telegrams from American liaison officers arrived, crisp and urgent. He had seen many things in his lifetime: columns of tanks rolling across France, the Blitz reducing streets to rubble, but this felt different. Not destruction, not rescue. A new power striding across his capital, fully armed, fully confident, and fully untested in European politics. The American troops, part of the 1st US Army, were preparing to march through London for the very first time. Churchill's aides shuffled papers nervously. They whispered of protocol, of the importance of first impressions, of maintaining decorum. Churchill ignored them. He had always been a student of symbolism as much as strategy. He understood that a marching army is never just soldiers, it is an idea made flesh. And here, before his eyes, a new idea was entering London, an idea shaped in steel, democracy, and unspoken ambitions. From the window, he could see the young Americans lining up along the Mall. Their uniforms were crisp, the stripes bright, the rifles gleaming. There was a precision in their formation that London had not seen in years, not since the disciplined, exhausted rhythm of the Home Guard. And yet, for all their order, there was a confidence that bordered on insolence, not personal, not disrespectful, but inescapable. This was a nation arriving not to beg, not to plead, but to assert its presence. Churchill exhaled a thin plume of smoke. He murmured to himself, perhaps to measure the moment, perhaps to steady his own calculations. They are magnificent and dangerously unaware. There was no anger, no delight, only recognition. Recognition of a power that might change everything, for better or worse. He remembered his conversations with Roosevelt, letters exchanged in code and subtle tones, promises of support, pledges of patience. And now, those promises were taking form, marching past Buckingham Palace, past the Houses of Parliament, into the very heart of the Empire. Each bootstep was a reminder: Britain could no longer act alone. Allies were no longer optional. They were the axis upon which survival turned. Yet, in the private corners of the Prime Minister's mind, there was unease. These troops, no matter how disciplined, were a symbol of dependence. Britain had fought years on its own soil. Britain had endured firebombs, rationing, the steady drip of attrition. And now the Americans came fresh, confident, insulated from the immediate horrors of London's nights. Their presence was both a shield and a mirror. A shield against Hitler's ambitions, yes, but a mirror of Britain's own diminished autonomy. As the first platoons passed, the band struck up the Star-Spangled Banner. The notes carried across the Thames, over the crowd, over the war-scarred streets. Churchill's face did not change. His aides expected a gesture applause, a salute, a smile, but he said nothing at first. And then, quietly, almost conversationally, he turned to his private secretary and said words that would linger far longer than any ceremony. So this is the arrival of a new world. A statement, yes, but more than that, a warning, a recognition, a private reckoning. London had endured, but London had changed, and Churchill, master of symbols and shadows, understood that the world had changed with it. The march continued, the cadence echoing off stone and steel, and for a moment time seemed to hold, suspended between what had been fought for and what was now arriving unbidden. The streets of London were alive with a rare, uneasy spectacle. August sunlight cut through the haze of wartime smoke, illuminating the sharp lines of American khaki as they moved in perfect rhythm past the War Office, past Trafalgar Square, past the silent monuments to Britain's own endurance. Citizens craned their necks, some cheering, some whispering, and everywhere the shadow of expectation pressed against the city. Churchill stood in the cabinet war room later that afternoon, the echo of boots still clinging to his ears. He did not congratulate anyone, did not issue commands. Instead, he traced invisible patterns across the map of Europe, eyes narrowing over occupied France, over the soft underbelly of Italy, over North Africa. The Americans were here. Their tanks, their divisions, their ships and planes, all were promises waiting to be delivered. But promises came with conditions, and conditions carried obligations. His aides tried to frame it as morale. "Sir," one ventured carefully, "the sight of them marching boosts public confidence. The Americans are allies in every sense." Churchill waved him off. "Morale, yes, but not sovereignty." He understood alliance politics as a game of perception and leverage. Britain had fought alone for nearly 3 years, hardened by fire and necessity. To now rely openly on American troops, even to invite them into the streets of London, was to admit that Britain was no longer the unquestioned leader of the free world. Across the Atlantic, Roosevelt's communications had been reassuring but firm. The Americans were willing to fight, willing to supply, willing to plan. But they expected their methods respected, their priorities observed, their men treated with the courtesy due a modern military force. For Churchill, this was a delicate balance. Too accommodating, and Britain risked appearing weak. Too resistant, and the alliance could fracture before it had even solidified. And yet, as he watched dispatches arrive from commanders in the field, he could feel the subtle shift. The Americans brought numbers, technology, and a fresh perspective, but also impatience. Their operational tempo was faster, more direct, less bound by the cautious calculations that had kept London alive through the Blitz. They measured success differently. They valued speed over preparation, results over protocol. Britain's methods, honed by years of attrition and careful diplomacy, sometimes seemed almost quaint. Churchill's personal diary, never meant for public eyes, recorded a terse note that afternoon. "Their efficiency is admirable. Their energy is undeniable, yet there is arrogance in their confidence, and I must remember who built this city from fire." The entry was brief but revealing, admiration and anxiety in equal measure, pride and the prick of insecurity. Britain had endured alone. Now it must negotiate its relevance within the very alliance meant to protect it. Later, as the sun set over the Thames, he walked along the embankment, the distant rumble of American tanks echoing through the city. Civilians gathered, waving flags, children clutched their parents' hands, and in the midst of it all, Churchill realized that this was more than a ceremonial march. It was a lesson in humility. It was the moment Britain confronted the reality that alliances are rarely equal. Some nations bring wealth, some manpower, some history. For some, the simple fact of their presence can rewrite the rules of engagement. Churchill's mind returned to the words he had whispered that morning. So this is the arrival of a new world. Now he understood the weight behind them. This was not just an observation, it was a question. How would Britain navigate a war where it was no longer the unquestioned master of its destiny, where its decisions would be tempered by the needs, the ambitions, the speed of others? The American columns disappeared into the distance, their march ending for the day. But the tremor of their presence remained, settling into London like dust over old battle scars. The Prime Minister returned to his papers, the weight of diplomacy and command pressing down. Speed versus preparation, results versus protocol. The questions were no longer theoretical. They were marching down the streets, in formation, visible for all to see. And Churchill, master strategist, would have to decide, bend, negotiate, or risk fracturing the fragile alliance on which Britain's survival now depended. By late afternoon, the streets of London were quiet again, though the echo of boots and rifles lingered like a memory. Inside 10 Downing Street, Churchill sat alone for a moment. The official meetings concluded, the aides and officers gone. The smoke from his cigar curled in slow spirals above the mahogany desk, a fragile counterpoint to the gravity in his mind. Outside, the city hummed with the residual energy of the march, an energy that belonged, at least in part, to another nation. Churchill had never underestimated Roosevelt, nor the Americans' capacity for decisive action. But he had underestimated the weight of their presence in the heart of Britain itself. Watching those troops pass through London had been like watching a tide roll in, carrying both protection and challenge. He was struck by the simplicity of their confidence, the unspoken assertion that Britain, for all its history, must now share the stage. A knock at the door broke the silence. Chief of Staff Sir Hastings Ismay entered, carrying dispatches from the War Cabinet. Churchill motioned him to place them on the desk, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room. "Hastings," he said, voice low, "do you feel it?" Ismay frowned. "Feel what, Prime Minister?" "The shift," Churchill replied. "The moment when one realizes that they are no longer the principal architect of the war." that someone else fresh, eager, and untested may set the pace. The Americans are here, not to learn from us, but to act. And soon we will be measured against them not just by our victories, but by the tempo of our action. Ismay remained silent. He understood, as all of Churchill's aides did, that this was more than a tactical or logistical concern, it was psychological, a subtle but seismic reordering of hierarchy. Britain had endured alone for years. London had burned, the people had starved, the RAF had fought impossible odds. And now, these young Americans, clean, well-fed and full of initiative, marched through the capital with the unspoken authority of the new industrial military power. Churchill's mind returned to the morning's march. He could still see the glint of rifles, the synchronized swing of boots, the disciplined gaze of officers who had never known London's nights of terror. And in that vision he had found both reassurance and unease. Reassurance that Britain would not stand alone in the war. Unease that the nation he had led from the edge of annihilation would no longer occupy the center of its own destiny. Later, in the cabinet room, he confronted Roosevelt's telegrams again. They were courteous, almost deferential, but firm in their demands. Supply lines needed to be prioritized, exercises coordinated and operations synchronized. It was cooperation, yes, but also an assertion of influence. The Americans would fight, yes, but on their terms as well as Britain's. Churchill recognized the implicit calculus. He could accept their terms or risk the friction that might undermine both nations' goals. He jotted a single line in his private notebook: Allies, yes. Equals, never. It was a paradox. Britain needed America as it had never needed another nation. And yet, the acknowledgement of dependency cut deep into pride, into identity, into years of enduring alone. The march had been ceremonial, public, but the consequences were private, intimate, and inescapable. Churchill exhaled and set the pen down. Outside, London settled into its uneasy rhythm. But within the Prime Minister's mind, a quiet war had begun, one not fought with rifles, but with diplomacy, strategy, and the delicate art of preserving sovereignty while embracing indispensable help. In the coming days, decisions would have to be made about coordination, command, and control. But in that private moment, Churchill allowed himself a single honest thought. The arrival of American troops was not just the addition of strength, it was the admission that Britain was no longer the lone master of its fate. And the question lingered, heavy and unspoken: could pride and pragmatism ever truly coexist when survival demanded compromise? Days passed, and London streets returned to their muted rhythm, yet the impression of the American march remained vivid, like an indelible watermark on the city. Churchill moved through meetings with generals, ministers, and foreign envoys, each conversation layered with an unspoken tension: how to integrate a force both indispensable and potentially overwhelming. The first U.S. Army was not merely arriving to fight, it was arriving to reshape the structure of command itself. Churchill's advisors pushed plans and proposals, eager to exploit the American presence. "Prime Minister," one officer said, "we can finally execute the cross-channel raids, the strategic offensives. With their support, victory is within reach." Victory, yes. But Churchill's mind circled back to an earlier observation, one he had made quietly, to himself: speed versus preparation, results versus protocol. The Americans embodied urgency, Britain embodied caution, and caution had kept the capital alive during its darkest nights. The first formal coordination meeting between British and American generals took place in a tense, windowless chamber. Maps littered the walls, markers traced the shadows of armies moving across Europe and North Africa. U.S. commanders spoke in brisk, confident tones, outlining plans for a rapid build-up, mobilization, and eventual offensive. Their energy was infectious, their optimism is unshakable. And yet Churchill noticed the subtle frictions: requests framed as recommendations, suggestions as expectations, differences in rank treated with almost casual disregard for British hierarchy. When the American Chief of Staff concluded a proposal for a large-scale training exercise on the southern coast, Churchill remained silent for a moment. Then carefully he said, "We will accommodate your schedule, but remember, London does not bend easily, and the men here have earned their discipline through necessity, not convenience." A polite, warning. Yet beneath it was the hard truth: Britain had to concede, but not surrender. Every decision, every compromise, became a negotiation of influence, a contest of authority that would define the alliance for years to come. Churchill later confided to Ismay, "We are trading autonomy for strength, Hastings. Every step we allow them to dictate, every plan we adopt without question, diminishes our voice in the councils of war. Yet without them we would crumble." The calculus was simple, yet morally complex. To accept American methods was to accelerate operations, to reduce risk for British troops, to shore up civilian morale, but at the cost of influence, tradition, and pride. Every move forward carried both benefits and losses. By September, the impact of the American presence became undeniable. Supplies flowed more efficiently, training accelerated, and British units observed techniques that were unfamiliar but effective. Londoners felt relieved that reinforcements had arrived. But Churchill noted the subtle side effects: British officers deferring decisions they would have once made decisively, debates ending sooner because American insistence carried more weight, cultural assumptions subtly shifting. Britain's authority in its own war was being shared, sometimes willingly, sometimes under the quiet pressure of necessity. The Prime Minister returned repeatedly to a central thought: alliances are not merely agreements, they are a redistribution of power, a constant negotiation between mutual interest and personal prerogative. And as he watched the soldiers march in drill fields, their boots cutting arcs across the mud, he understood that the march through London had been both ceremonial and prophetic. The city had witnessed not just an army, but a reordering of influence. The consequences were clear. Britain gained speed, resources, and an expanded front of power, but it also lost a measure of unquestioned autonomy. Decisions that had once been solely British were now subject to negotiation, compromise, or acquiescence. And in the quiet moments, Churchill recognized the moral weight of that trade. Survival demanded concession, but concession carried its own cost, one measured not in lives or tanks, but in sovereignty and prestige. Months later, the streets of London had returned to their muted rhythm. Yet the echo of that August march lingered in the corridors of power. Churchill often reflected on it, not as a spectacle, not as a ceremonial gesture, but as a moment when history whispered its unvarnished truth. The Americans had arrived, and with them, a subtle but inexorable shift. Britain was no longer the sole arbiter of strategy, the uncontested center of a global war. Churchill recorded in his private notes, "They are here, and we survive, but not unchanged." And that is a truth more costly than any casualty. He understood, better than most, that alliances are instruments of necessity rather than sentiment. The presence of American troops in London had been both shield and mirror, a shield against Hitler's ambitions, a mirror reflecting Britain's new position in the world. In the calm of his office, he could trace the contours of what had been gained and what could never be regained. Britain had gained reinforcements, fresh manpower, technological support, and the assurance that victory might be attainable after years of attrition. The march itself had been a statement of resolve, a visible testament to the unity between two democracies under threat. Civilians cheered, newspapers framed the event as a moment of transatlantic brotherhood, and morale, temporarily at least, soared. On the surface it was a triumph or reassurance to a nation weary of waiting, wondering if help would ever arrive. Yet beneath that triumph lay a quieter, sharper reality. The march revealed that Britain's influence over its own destiny was now intertwined with American priorities. Operational tempo, strategic choices, even the pace of liberation across Europe, these were no longer solely British decisions. The arrival of the Americans had introduced both opportunity and constraint. Britain would win battles, yes, but the framework of victory was increasingly shared, negotiated, and, in some ways, imposed by forces outside its control. Churchill recognized the moral complexity of this new arrangement. To resist American methods outright would have been catastrophic. To embrace them fully was to risk the erosion of authority and tradition. The calculus of survival demanded compromise, and compromise demanded quiet acquiescence. Pride, he noted, was a luxury war could not afford, and yet, that very acquiescence carried an emotional cost that was harder to quantify: the recognition that Britain's primacy had ceded ground quietly in the heart of its capital. History would remember the march as a moment of unity, of strength, of allied resolve. few would record the subtler truth that London, for all its endurance, had seen the arrival of a power that would redefine its position in the world. The march had been a ceremony, yes, but also a reckoning. Every step the Americans took through London was a reminder that survival had a price, that sovereignty is often negotiated in the spaces between necessity and pride. Churchill never shared this judgment publicly, but in private he acknowledged it. Fully and without rhetorical flourish, Britain had survived the Blitz, weathered the isolation, and endured when many thought it would fall. And yet, the march of American troops through London had quietly announced that the world was no longer solely Britain's stage. Some victories are celebrated. Some truths, however, are lived quietly, carried in the pause between orders, in the unsmiling gaze of a prime minister watching history march past. And so, the final assessment lingered like smoke in a room. Britain had gained allies, strength, and hope, but it had also surrendered a measure of control, and with it, a fragment of its self-image. As the unchallenged arbiter of destiny, a quiet, devastating truth, survival sometimes requires that the world march through your streets while you watch, knowing the rules have changed forever.